Hello and welcome to Inside Iraq from London. I'm Jasim Al-Azzawi. Clare Short was a rising star in British politics. She resigned in protest against the war and lambasted Prime Minister Blair for taking Britain to war with President Bush. There is no collective leadership because there is no collective. There is simply a diktat, she says. But her critics ask, why didn't she resign before the invasion? Ms. Short, welcome to Inside Iraq special here from London. If I can go back to the period just before the war, did the British cabinet, and you were a member of the British cabinet, discuss the potential post-invasion chaos that we are seeing right now?
No, the British cabinet hasn't functioned properly as a cabinet in all the Blair years. There's little chats, but no kind of proper consideration of all options and coming to a general view. And we now know from the Butler report there were lots of papers prepared that were never circulated to the cabinet. The legal advice, although it's meant to be circulated according to the ministerial code, was never circulated. So there were little chats, you know, led by Tony about what had happened in the last week, and it was all became very, and the country was angry. There was lots of tension everywhere. And so just keeping people together to get the vote on the war was all that was done, and there was never any serious discussion in the full cabinet of the post-war situation. And then there was a war cabinet that met every day that during the conflict phase, and it then would discuss what had happened the day before. But there was never, this is the military phase, then it ends, this is how things will be organised, here are the options.
But that's
because
amazing.
Tony was trying to keep everyone together without telling them what was really going on, because he was playing his own game and had made his own promises to President Bush and wasn't really honest with his cabinet or parliament about those promises, and therefore it wasn't a normal collective discussion of options and decisions.
That's amazing. I mean, with the benefit of hindsight, now we know what Iraq is. It's pretty much a disaster, and yet the writing was on the wall. Many scholars, many think tanks, organizations pretty much warned President Bush, as well as Tony Blair, that the post-invasion period is going to be the most colossal and daunting process of the whole things. It's amazing you say the cabinet itself did not discuss the potential of chaos in Iraq.
It didn't, and that's because, as I say, and the Butler report said this, the cabinet is not operating, wasn't operating properly in Britain, but lots of work was done about a possible post-conflict situation. I mean, there was both in the UN, in my department and other places, because we didn't know quite what was going on. At first we thought, we're not going to prepare for after a war because we're making the war more likely. And then we thought, but this is irresponsible, we ought to prepare for all eventualities. And so the UN quietly, but very thoroughly, started working to mobilise the whole international system for a post-conflict situation, as did my department. We were in touch with the State Department and other development agencies that cooperate post-conflict across the world. And there was masses of work done in the State Department and lots of discussion about the danger of chaos and discussion of the need to only get rid of the top leadership of the Ba'athist regime and leave everyone else in place, because the nature of the Saddam Hussein regime was that all professionals had to join the party, and if you sacked them all, you wouldn't have the structures of a state. So all these things were discussed. But then, just a couple of months, just over 2 months before the chosen date for the war, because at the time we didn't know that was it, President Bush took away all responsibility from the State Department and set up a new unit inside the Pentagon, ORHA, Organisation for Rehabilitation and Humanitarian Action in Iraq, and it started from scratch, threw away all those preparations and was very much its own operation. And that was because they didn't want international cooperation. They didn't want a big UN role.
So you did not have an opportunity to warn Blair that things is going to go bad?
Well, what happened with me was that Blair was telling me extra lies to try and keep me in the government. So when I was about to leave and I booked my place to make my speech in the House of Commons the same day as Robin Cook, he had me in to negotiate with me and said, what would make me keep you, you know, what could I do to stop you resigning? Because I'd said on a radio programme that I would do so. I said, you should proceed through the UN, but if the war's unstoppable, we must have a promise that the reconstruction of Iraq is internationalised, led by the UN, and is not an occupation, and we must implement the roadmap on Israel-Palestine. And he said, right, I will get Bush to announce his support for the roadmap, which he did. And he said, I promise you the UN lead. And that's the reason that he persuaded me to stay. I thought we can't stop the war, but we can prevent aftermath being a disaster. And I'm afraid he was just saying those things to keep me happy. He didn't mean them. He wasn't saying those things to Bush. So, of course, what was happening in my department and our preparations wasn't going anywhere because Bush, in the meantime, had thrown away all the preparations and handed it over to Rumsfeld.
Ms. Short, perhaps that is the period perhaps you're referring between September to March 2003. But once the date pretty much was cast and it was decided, when, if you remember, in Portugal, President Bush gave Saddam Hussein just 2 days for himself and his sons to leave. Perhaps wouldn't that have been the logical date for you to resign as opposed to resign later on in May?
Well, as I've said to you, I'd said publicly that if we don't have a UN resolution to authorise military action, I will leave the government. And then Tony Blair went into a big panic and kept inviting me in and asking to see me and asking what he had to do to stop me from resigning. And he made these two promises. One, he got President Bush to say, because I'm thinking, if you can't stop the conflict, which we couldn't by then, what's going to happen in the Middle East? It could be an absolute disaster. Whereas if we had a real international cooperation to help the people of Iraq rebuild their country and no one trying to occupy and control them, Iraq would move forward. And if we really, the roadmap promised a Palestinian state by the end of 2005, and if we got that, the whole atmosphere in the Middle East would be transformed. So he promised these things, and I said, all right, then I won't go. But then it became clear he hadn't meant those things to be implemented. He meant just to keep me sweet and tell me things that weren't true to stop me going.
The late Robin Cook resigned before the war. Many people, they say, perhaps had Clare Short and Robin Cook jointly, and perhaps joined by others, resigned collectively. That would have sent a powerful and shocking jolt into the cabinet, and perhaps Blair himself might have revisited the decision to go to war. Is that something with the benefit of hindsight, or regardless whoever resigned or how many people resigned, Blair was pretty much adamant that he's going to go locksteps with President Bush to war?
I think Blair was adamant, and I think we now know from all the leaked documents that he gave his promise long before, and he was telling us things that didn't, you know, he said, I'll only do it with the UN, whereas he'd already promised President Bush and so on. But I think if Robin and I had talked to each other, Robin never told me he was going to resign. If we'd gone to the cabinet, the two of us, and said, this is wrong, we may have been able to cause more doubt and more trouble. On the other hand, it was very late. Would it have
stopped the war machine?
I don't think so. I mean, the question is, would Britain have opted out? We were running up to the vote in the House of Commons. There was never any question that that vote would be lost because the Conservative Party was voting with the government. The issue was how big the Labour rebellion would be. If Robin and I had gone together and had prepared for it together and openly argued it, probably the rebellion would have been bigger. It wouldn't have stopped the war, but it would have made more and more pressure on Tony Blair.
To do what?
Well,
what
to
kind
think
of pressure?
again.
I mean, if he was going to go to war,
to think again
what else can you do to him?
Well, you can get him. If you remember, right at the last minute, I think it was Rumsfeld said to Jeff Hoon, "You can peel off if you want. We'll go anyway. We'll go without you." That might have happened. And I think that would have made real problems for President Bush, because American public opinion was saying, yes, in coalition, not alone. But the problem is, everyone was individualised. No one was talking to each other. Even when Robin went, he didn't come to the meeting where the legal authority for war was discussed. He just went. He never came and argued. He never came and told the cabinet that he was going to resign. I think if we had stood together, those of us who were unhappy, Robin and I mean, that was clear from the discussions we'd had before, and really argued with the rest of the cabinet much more openly and earlier. We might have changed things.
You did not resign before the war, you resigned after the war, you resigned in May, and ostensibly the reason for your resignation, perhaps one way or another related to the war, but it was related to the UN draft resolution about the post-invasion construction or reconstruction of Iraq. Was that the real cause, because you read something that you totally disagreed with, or some people say this is just a belated justification and an excuse for her reason, really, that she was against the war?
I think it's silly to argue I'm doing something belatedly. If I was leaving the government, that's leaving the government. There's no advantage to me to go a bit later. In fact, just for my own image and praise from people, I would have got much more credit if I went when Robin went. I stayed because I could see an absolute disaster coming. By then, I think the war was unstoppable. But of course, the military phase was a very short phase. It's what came afterwards that destroyed Iraq and destroyed the possibilities of life for the people of Iraq. And as I said, in trying to persuade me not to go, Tony Blair promised a full UN lead, and that's not just the UN, it would mean a complete internationalisation of the reconstruction. It would have been probably troops from many different countries, including Muslim countries. It would have been a big international united effort. It would have been much more in the service of the people of Iraq and much less an occupation trying to control them. And I think if it had been done right, because if you remember, immediately after the conflict, most Iraqi people were hopeful of a better life.
Ms. Short, we'll take a short break now. And when we come back, we'll continue our discussion with Ms. Short. Stay with us. I'm going to ask her, did MI6 really bug the offices of UN Secretary General Kofi Annan? Stay with us.
Clare was in the cabinet that voted to go to war. She personally voted to send people to war, and now she is a woman on a mission to depose Blair. Lorna Fitzsimmons, MP for Rochdale.